welcome. Take a moment to settle in. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breathing grow slower, deeper. The light of your screen may still glow softly in your room, but here, in your mind, dusk is falling. The air is cool and carries a whisper of sea, salt, and ash. In the distance, the faint rhythm of waves rolls across a stony shoreline. You are not in your own time anymore. You've wandered backward through centuries, into the 9th or 10th century, into the uncertain morning hours of a forgotten coastal village. Pressed low against a gray and wind-lashed horizon, the thatched roofs are damp with mist. The fields are silent, but for the stir of sleeping animals, the people of this small settlement are just beginning to stir, unaware, for now, of what approaches them from across the sea. Tonight, we will walk slowly, softly, through this world. We will listen to the rhythm of their lives. We will understand the fabric of their routines, what it meant to wake, to work, to eat, to hope in the tense and beautiful spaces that existed at the edge of the known world, where faith in heaven stood beside the threat of the longship. This is not a story of battle cries or cinematic violence. This is not a tale told in fire and blood. It is something quieter. It is the pulse of survival. It is the hour by hour unraveling of a morning in which a world could change forever, and you gently and calmly will walk through it all, through that first hour. The moment when the sails first rose on the horizon, when silence cracked open, when history brushed its hand over ordinary lives, we will move gently, respectfully, from daily routines into the lives of real people, into the fog of uncertainty, the eerie quiet before upheaval. We will reflect on what it was to live in that world, and perhaps, in some small way, understand how they endured. So lie back. Let your thoughts slow. Let history unfold like a tide coming in. Our story begins. Before the first horn sounds, before the fear, before the fire. It begins with routine, with habit, with the small rituals of waking life on the edge of a dark sea. Imagine yourself waking beneath a woolen blanket, the air in your dwelling still cool with night's retreat. A thin shaft of gray light trickles through the cracks in the wooden slats that make up the walls of your home. The hearth has long gone cold. The last embers of yesterday's fire, now silent and blackened in the ash. This is a coastal settlement, perhaps along the eastern edge of what we now call England, or a stretch of Irish shore. It is not a grand place, nor a poor one. Its people are humble, but hardy. The village hugs the land, low and cautious, ever wary of winds from the sea. The smell of damp thatch and earth is constant, not unpleasant, but deeply rooted in the bones of every structure. This place was built to endure storms, but not all storms are of the weather. The day begins, not with alarm, but with the simple gestures of survival. A woman stirs to feed the animals a few sheep, perhaps, or goat sand, to press down the wooden latch at the door, reminding it to keep out the wind. She moves through habit, not haste, her feet padded in worn leather, the floor cold beneath her steps. A pot of barley gruel is set to warm, slowly, with a pinch of salt that had to be gathered painstakingly from the coast the week before. Outside, the mist hangs low, veiling the hills in a soft and colorless drape. The world is quiet, beautifully, deceptively quiet. Chickens rustle faintly in their enclosures. A boy tugs on a tunic and hurries to the well with a wooden bucket, its iron banding worn smooth by years of use. Across the village, a man checks the fish traps laid the night before. Another inspects the winter cabbage rows, watching for signs of rot or salt spray damage. These tasks are not glamorous. They are not dramatic, but they are the rhythm that binds this place together. In the small chapel, not much more than a timber frame and thatch roof, a priest recites the morning's prayer, softly, barely above a whisper. The language is half Latin, half the local tongue, and carries more comfort than clarity. Some attend, most do not. Faith is woven into the day here, but not always loudly. There is too much to do, too much to carry, for ceremony alone. Children, if they are lucky, will be tasked with turning the dairy churns or chasing off birds from the grain stores. Their laughter is not loud, but it is present. In this early hour, they are still free of the burdens their parents shoulder. For now, the morning belongs to the living, and not yet to memory. The boats used by the villagers short, round, unassuming are pulled safely above the tide line, propped on wooden supports. They are not built for war, only for work, gathering fish, ferrying goods, nets dry on low fences, patched over and over again with coarse thread. There is a lookout. Of course, there is always a lookout. His post is small, little more than a platform on a rise, and his eyes sweep the sea with a kind of weary diligence. In truth, many seasons pass without incident, but all it takes is one. Just one morning when the line between sea and sky breaks, and the dragon-prowed hulls appear. But for now, there is no sign of danger, only the wind, the tide, and the gentle shuffle of lives unfolding. The villagers know nothing yet of what today will bring. Their thoughts remain close to earth. How much barley remains, whether the piglets will survive the month, if the weather will finally turn. Simple concerns, real ones. The village breathes slowly. You can feel it if you listen. The creak of wood, the murmur of water, the rhythm of their lives. Uninterrupted for now. But the hour is shifting, far beyond the mist, unseen by any here. Sails are being drawn up, oars dipped into water. The morning holds its breath, and soon the first shadow will fall upon the shore. Beyond the line of sight, far across the gray wash of open water, something moves with quiet purpose. The sea here is not gentle. It rolls and steady. Patience swells enough to churn the belly of any who are not used to its rhythm. The sky above is a flat canvas of dull silver, neither stormy nor bright. The world is painted in grays and muted blues. But along this uncertain horizon, new shapes begin to cut through the haze. They are not large, by modern standards perhaps 70 feet from stern to carved prowbutt. They are fast, unnervingly fast. They ride low, designed for speed and shallow water, with hulls that could slip up rivers or hug a coastline unnoticed. The sails, dyed with ochre and soot, ripple tightly in the breeze, while oars dip in perfect rhythm. 50 hands working in eerie silence. There are no horns, no war cries. Not yet. Noise is a tool, one used only when the advantage has already been taken. For now, they rely on surprise. The ships approach like shadows moving across a wet stone there, and then gone, then closer again, always closer. The men aboard these longships are not one people, not one tribe. They come from many parts of the North Norway, Denmark, the scattered archipelago. Some are seasoned raiders, their hands roughened by years of oar work, and others are younger, eager, unproven. What binds them together is not nationality, but purpose. They are here for silver, for food, for cattle and slaves, not for glory. Glory is a luxury. Survival and gain are their currency. The ships are bare of comfort. No shelter, no bedding. The men sleep when they can, curled on boards between Now, as they approach the coast, they murmur to one another in low tones, sometimes in jest, sometimes with sharp edge. They point to landmarks they recognize. Some have come here before, others have only heard tales. The land ahead is not unknown, just One man sharpens a blade slowly on a whetstone, the rasping sound carried off by the wind. Another adjusts the binding on a leather helm, checking its fit. They are not uniformed. There are no matching colors. A few wear mail, scavenged or bought. Most wear layers of wool and hide, but all are armed to spears. Short axes, round shields, not ornate, but functional, used and trusted. The wind favors them. That much is clear. It fills their sail just enough to keep the oarsmen fresh, just enough to bring them steadily forward. Their leader, a man of calm demeanor and heavy brow, stands at the prow of the lead ship. He says little. His presence is felt more than heard. He scans the coastline ahead. He knows it's near. There is always smoke from cooking fires. Always the faint signs of human settlement if you know how to look. A column of gulls rises over a distant bluff. A bend in the shore reveals a sheltered inlet ideal for beaching quickly and close. He nods once, and a few oars rise silently from the water and signal. The others respond in kind. Back in the village, no one sees them yet. The lookout's view is compromised by the curve of the land. A rise of trees blocks the inlet. The villagers are scattered, each tending to morning tasks. A dog barks once at the edge of the field, but no one thinks much of it. Children gather water from the stream, arguing in quiet tones about who spilled what. The ships move like they belong to the sea, like they were carved from it. Their approach is not a charge. It is a glide, unnervingly smooth. Soon, they will round the last bluff, and the beach will open before them. There will be no time then for warning, no chance to organize defense. But in this moment, just before landfall, there is a kind of stillness, a breath held by both sides of the coming storm. On one hand, a world built from routine and hope. On the other, a force built for disruption, unburdened by guilt or diplomacy. Soon, the first hull will scrape the sand. Soon, the air will shift. But for now, they draw ever close and seen, unstoppable, silent. It begins not with a roar, but with a sound barely heard the wet, dragging hush of wooden holes grounding on sand. A muffled scrape, the creak of oars withdrawn, the crunch of boots stepping ashore. By the time the lookout sees them, it is already too late to sound the horn. He stares, frozen, as the ships appear from behind the risewind. Then two, then a third emerging from mist like ghosts in formation. The carved prows, shaped like dragons or sea serpents, loom larger with each heartbeat. He turns to run. Below, the village continues its routines. A pot simmers slowly. A child tries to climb a fence and falls laughing. Two men discuss the softness of the soil, debating whether it's fit for planting barley. They do not see what now arrived. The first cry rises not from the lookout, but from a girl chasing chickens near the edge of the path. She sees the men foreign, fast, unfamiliar. One of them shouts in a tongue she does not recognize. Another waves his arm, gesturing with something metallic, short-handled, ugly in the morning light. The girl runs, barefoot, forgetting the chickens. Her scream is high and clear, thin as a string pulled taut. That is the sound that breaks the spell. That is when the silence ends. The village erupts, not in battle, but in confusion. Door slam. Footsteps pound. There's no organized defense, no garrison, no wall. A few men grab tools, hoes, long knives, axes meant for wood. Others yell to their wives, their children, their neighbors. There is no central plan, only instinct. Some rush toward the chapel, hoping it offers sanctuary. Others flee in the opposite direction, toward the trees or the fields. A few try to stand their ground. Older men, younger ones caught up in panic or pride. Their stances are wide, but their hands tremble. The raiders move quickly. They fan out, knowing this type of terrain well. Their goal is not conquest, but extraction. They do not need to destroy everything only to take what is valuable, leave swiftly, and vanish before any outside force can respond. Time is their enemy. The longer they linger, the greater the risk. A man steps outside with a scythe in hand, his face pale. He shouts something incoherent, then charges forward. He doesn't reach the nearest attacker. He's struck down into motions fast, efficient. There is no ceremony in it. The ground takes him silently. The villagers watching do not scream in horror. They are beyond that. There is only motion now, grabbing loved ones, grabbing food, grabbing anything at all and running. The older children are told to hide. The younger ones are picked up bodily and carried. Those who have seen this kind of raid before, if not here, then in stories or past lives, know that staying visible is a mistake. The air is thick with smoke, already rising from one of the thatch burns easily, greedily. the heat pushing upward into the damp sky. The livestock pen is broken open. Some pigs already gone, others squealing and sprinting in wild arcs across the village. And still, through it all, a few figures stand and fight. Not many, but a handful. They are fathers, brothers, sons, their eyes locked not on glory, but on time. If they can buy a few seconds, just a few more seconds, perhaps someone else will reach the trees, reach the path, reach the hidden stream that leads away from the coast. These men do not last long, but they do not expect to. The chapel bell rings once. Then again, not in cadence, but in desperation. Not a call to prayer, but a cry for help. There is no answer. There will be no answer. And still, behind all of this dust sound, the fire, the rising panic there, is the sea, calm, indifferent, always present. It does not care for violence. It only receives what is returned to it, and soon it will welcome the ships again. But the hour is not yet over. Not yet. There are still lives moving through the smoke, still choices made in moments too fast to remember, yet too sharp to ever forget. Not everyone ran. Not everyone fought. There are always those who hide. Beneath one home-modest timber-framed structure, with a sloping thatch roof and walls, a woman crouches behind stacked clay pots. Her arms wrapped around her two sons. The older is silent, jaw clenched. The younger stares at the flickering light coming through the cracks between the boards. He doesn't blink often enough. The crawl space beneath the floor is barely tall enough for sitting. It smells of old soot and packed dirt. It's where salted fish is stored. Sometimes apples wrapped in straw through the colder months. Tonight, it holds lives, hearts thudding slowly, steadily, in sync with fear. Elsewhere, inside the chapel, a few have gathered. The old priest, hunched with age, murmurs half-remembered prayers. His hands tremble, but he does not stop. A mother clutches her daughter beside the altar. A boy peers through a crack in the door. They do not bolt it. They know a wooden door cannot hold back what has come. Some have hidden in the earth itself, in shallow root cellars, built to keep vegetables cool in summer, in dry wells, covered quickly with brush and prayer, in forest undergrowth, eyes wide, clothed damp with morning dew. They breathe shallowly, as if air itself might give them away. These are not cowards. They are survivors. They are doing what generations before them have always done when the storm could not be faced head-on. They disappear. A dog whines, not understanding the tension, but feeling it deeply. Its body pressed low, tail tucked. The family it belongs to is silent, flat against the floor of the woodshed, barely breathing. The doors ajar, on purpose set, cannot appear shut. Every detail matters when you are trying to convince the world you are not here. Outside, the sounds continue: feet, shouting, the thud of movement, the occasional clash of metal. Though most weapons are not used in formal combat, they are used quickly, then carried on. These are not sieges. These are strikes. A child sneezes. It's not loud, not sharp, but in the silence, it cuts like a blade. The mother's hand covers his face instantly, soft and firm. She rocked slightly, wordlessly, praying that nothing nearby heard. Time stretches out unbearably in these moments. Seconds become entire hours. The ear strains, listening for any shift in sound, footsteps drawing closer, breathing that is not your own, the scrape of metal. But nothing comes. A few houses over, a small group of the raiders moves past the tool shed, eyes scanning for movement. One stops, looks at the door, fingers resting lightly on the axe at his hip. Then a call from behind, something urgent. He turns, they move on. The ones in hiding do not celebrate. They do not exhale loudly or weep in relief. They simply wait, still, focused. Animals holding still in the underbrush while danger passes overhead. They don't know how long to remain. No one tells them when the hour is up. They only know that if they wait long enough, The sounds will begin to fade. The fire will quiet. The air will shift, but not yet. Above them, the sky is beginning to lighten. The mist is lifting slightly. The world is still in the grip of something it does not yet understand. But beneath the floorboards, in cellars, under the roots and branches and beams, people hold tight to their place in this world. There is no shame in this, only the will to see another morning. Before this morning, before ships ever carved white lines into the sea toward this place, the village lived in patterns as old as memory. Their days were not loud. They were not filled with stories of conquest or kings. They were full of labor, repetition, and care. The land here is rugged coastal, windswept, and difficult to till. Crops must be chosen wisely, for the soil is not rich. Barley and oats do well. Flax grows slowly, but the village women spin it into linen in long, patient hours by the fire. Wool is more common, dyed with natural roots and berries into soft, uneven colors, smoky blues, pale greens, dull browns. A typical home is small, often one room. Its walls are woven wattle, smeared with a paste of mud and straw. The roof is thatch, tied tightly to a timber frame with cords of twisted grass or leather. Smoke from the hearth has no chimney. It finds its way upward through the weave of roof and rafters, giving everything inside a faint, wood-rich scent. There is little space for privacy. Family members sleep side by side, wrapped in blankets stuffed with dried grasses or tufts of wool. The father might rise early to check the traps or see to the animals. The mother prepares food for the day, sometimes before dawn, moving by habit in the low, flickering light of the fire. Children are expected to work as soon as they are old enough to carry or sweep or stir. There are no clocks, no schedules. The rhythm of each day is dictated by the sun, the tides, the weather. When it rains, tools are mended indoors. When the skies are clear, fields are weeded, fish are smoked, cloth is dyed. There are no weekends, only the Sabbath attended in modest clothes and solemn quiet. The priest speaks of humility, of charity. Trade happens irregularly. A traveling peddler may come once a season. Otherwise, barter with nearby villages' supplies. Most needs salted herring for beeswax, flax for pottery, a good axe head traded for 5 lengths of spun wool. Coin is rare and often foreign, Danish, Frankish, Byzantine. Most villagers keep 1 or 2 tucked away, more out of fascination than utility. There is music, but it is sparse. A carved flute, a rhythmic drum made from stretched hide. Sometimes in the evenings, by the fire, someone hums a tune old, nameless, passed down like a recipe or a story. These are the moments where life softens, where the day's work finds pause. Meals are plain, a stew of barley, onion, and root vegetables. Occasionally meat, pork, if the slaughter was recent, fish, if the traps were generous. Bread is dense, dark, and sour. It is torn rather than sliced, passed hand to hand. Cups are wooden, bowls roughly fired clay. Each item is a possession earned and maintained. Children do not attend school. They learn by watching, by imitating, by being. A boy learns to shape wood by watching his uncle carve handles. A girl learns to spin flax from her older sister's hands. They do not name it learning. It is simply life in motion, passed on. There are jokes, of course, teasing among neighbors, a friendly grumble about the fish being smaller this year, a story told in too many words, more for the rhythm of it than the point. These are not people without joy, but their joy is measured, quiet. A good harvest, a dry season, a healthy calf. These are victories. They celebrate them without music, without noise, with a nod, a shared meal, a silent thanks to their God. No one here expects history to remember them, and in truth, it rarely does. But history lives in these rhythms, in the small gestures repeated across generations, in hands made rough by work, not war. In the silence before an eruption. This is the life the raid will fracture. This is what will be scattered, not just in flame and theft, but in memory and the way survivors will no longer trust the mist, or the sound of the sea, or the idea that tomorrow will look like today. But here, in this segment, before all of that, life continues as it always had. His name has not survived the centuries. It may have been Aiden or Cuthard or something softer, more local, never written down. But in the village, he was known simply as the Reeve, the man charged with watching over the land, resolving disputes, seeing that the grain was weighed fairly, that the boundaries were respected. He was not a warrior by trade, but he carried a short sword, not finely made, its edge dulled by years of disuse, kept mostly for ceremony or show. It had belonged to his father. Before that, it hung in the hall of another village, now long abandoned to weather and ivy. This morning, when the girl screamed, when the lookout failed to return, when the sky cracked with the sound of a horn, unfamiliar and close, this man stood at the center of it all. He had risen early. His wife had handed him a cloth-wrapped bundle of bread and soft cheese. He had intended to walk the fields today, check the new fences. There was no reason to expect violence, but instinct speaks before reason, and instinct told him something had gone terribly wrong. He gathered the few others who could still hold a tool in anger. Not many. 3 men, perhaps 4, and a boy barely grown, eager but pale. They had no armor, no shields. One carried a sack. Another had a rusted spear once used to guard livestock from wolves. Still, they stood together, near the meeting hall, unsure whether to retreat or hold the line. The Reeve knew they could not win. He did not speak of victory. He spoke of time. "We hold as long as we can," he said, his voice low and flat. "We give the rest of them a chance to run." He did not shout. He did not offer words of glory. He only looked toward the trees, where figures were already disappearing into the brush. Women, children, the elderly. They had no plan beyond this moment. The raiders came fast. The Reeves saw their approach and counted 6, 8 more. Some bore shields painted with simple symbols. Others were beshested, wild-haired, lean from travel. They moved with the ease of men who had done this before. Still, the Reeve did not move. He stepped forward, feet wide, weight low, and drew his sword. It did not gleam. It looked tired. The others followed. The clash was not like the stories. There were no duels, no grand speeches, only movement and breath. Short and fast, a man to his left fell. The boy cried out. Another dropped his tool and ran. The Reeve held the line alone for a moment. Then, too, he was struck once. Then again, he did not fall quickly, but he fell. The raiders did not linger over him. They stepped over his body and moved on into the village center, toward the smoke, toward the sound of breaking wood and shouted command. Later, much later, a few survivors would return and find him there, still lying where he fell, his hand still on the hilt of the dull old sword. There would be no stone for him, no song, but he had stood, not because he thought he could win, but because someone had to stand. His name may be forgotten, but his hour remains. Time has a way of burying violence, not hiding it exactly, but softening its edges. Rain falls, trees grow, ash becomes soil, and slowly, the signs of what happened in a single, terrible hour fade from view unless you know how to look. Archaeologists have long puzzled over certain sites along coastal Britain, Ireland, and northern France. Scattered fragments of charred timber, layers of soil darkened by ash, a cluster of iron nails in an otherwise undisturbed field. The faint impression of a wall burned away, its outline only visible in the soil beneath. These are not grand battlefields. They are not fortified cities with written records and commemorative stones. They are small, rural, and nameless. But here and there, the earth remembers things people did not write down. At one side along the Yorkshire coast, a field excavation revealed a dense layer of carbonized material where no fire should have been. Beneath it, the remains of wattle walls, slumped inward, collapsed from heat and time. Mixed among them was small domestic objects, a spindle whorl, used for spinning wool, a child's bone needle, a clay cooking pot, cracked by sudden heat. There were no weapons found there. No defensive no organized burials. Just the quiet remains of a life interrupted. In another place, an island monastery off the Irish coast, excavations revealed a different story. The stone chapel remained largely intact, but its door had been reinforced, repaired over and over. Nearby, the bones of a dozen individuals, hastily buried in a shallow trench. No grave markers, no ceremony. Some showed signs of trauma fractures, blade cuts. Others were whole, perhaps having died of other causes, buried in the same pit for lack of time. The historical record may mention these events in passing. Pagans landed near the mouth of the river. Great suffering. The church was burned, but the records are sparse, and always from the perspective of those who survived to write them. For the villagers, the farmers, the children, there were no chronicles, only silence. Archaeology gives them back a voice in fragments. A hoard of silver buried hastily in a clay jar, never retrieved. A set of post holes marking a house rebuilt in slightly different alignment, perhaps, after the original was lost to fire. A belt buckle found 50 meters from the rest of a village site, bent and scorched. These are not relics of glory. They are not offerings or treasures. They are the mundane objects of lives lived in caution, interrupted in fear. One particularly haunting find came in a peat bog in Scotland. A wooden carving, small and worn smooth by handling. A figure, likely a saint or protector, held in the pocket of a person who had been fleeing when they died. There was no settlement nearby, no known battle, just a path that led nowhere, and a body that never made it further. These discoveries do not speak loudly. They do not shock or demand attention. They whisper. They say, someone was here. Someone fled. Someone dropped this when they ran. Someone had a life, and that life was altered in a moment. The sea brought strangers to shore. No one kept track of how many raids happened. We only have hints. A name in a chronicle. A scorch mark in the soil. A necklace found too far from any known dwelling. But if you listen closely, the earth still carries the memory. A few miles inland, perhaps. No more than an hour's walk. If you knew the forest path stood a manor house. Not a castle. Not yet. Stone fortifications were still rare in this part of the world. And expensive. But this hall was strong by the standards of the day. Thick timber walls, high beams, a defensive ditch, and a gate built from repurposed ship planks. It sat on a low rise, surrounded by fields, tilled by others, fed by the labor of nearby villages. Its lord was not young, nor cruel, but distant, accustomed to seeing the world through a lens of control. He dealt in obligation and protection. The villagers owed him part of their harvest, the fatted calf, and labor on demand. In return, he provided tools, justice, and if need be, defense. But defense depended on timing. On the morning of the raid, smoke was seen from the upper window. A thin thread at first, rising above the trees to the west. One of the household boys pointed it out while gathering water from the cistern. It was too much smoke for a hearth, too thin and high. Not a brush fire, not the usual burn-off from field clearing. The steward fetched the lord. He looked toward the horizon in silence. He said nothing for several long moments. Then he called for his horse, though he did not ride immediately. Instead, he stood, one hand on the pommel, calculating. He had perhaps 20 men-at-arms, trained, somewhat, equipped, moderately. Horses, a few, but not enough to move swiftly. By the time they could reach the coast, it would likely be over. He made a decision. He sent no one. To march down to the village would be to arrive late and invite an engagement he could not control. The raiders, if they had come, would be swift and likely gone by the time his men arrived. And if they weren't, then fighting them might draw the violence further inland. He turned from the window and returned to his hall. The manor gates were not opened that day. The smoke on the horizon rose higher. Some of the household staff watched it nervously. A few asked questions. They were told to be still. That night, the fires were kept low. No torches were set along the outer walk. No music. No dogs barking. The manor was a place of silence, as though pretending it did not exist. And the next morning, when scouts were sent out quietly along the wooded paths, they returned with word of what had been lost. The village had been struck, homes burned, storehouses emptied, people scattered. The Lord said little. He signed a ledger, made a note, issued instructions for compensation in grain, mostly to be distributed from the tide stores to the surviving families. He authorized repairs. He asked for the names of the dead. He offered no apology, no explanation, and perhaps, in the logic of the time, he owed none. His world was built on distance, on degrees of duty. He was not cruel. He simply did not act, and by not acting, his own house remained whole. In a different account, written years later by a monastic scribe, the event is mentioned obliquely. The northern village suffered grievous visitation. God preserved the house of Thanoric, which was spared through his providence. But those who lived near the coast did not credit providence. They remembered who had watched the smoke and remained still. This, too, was part of the world. A world where protection came slowly, if it came at all, where the powerful could shelter behind thick doors, while others held their breath beneath the floorboards. Before the morning turned strange, before dogs barked at shapes they couldn't see, and children were hushed mid-laughter, most women in the village were already working. Their hands were always moving, stirring, spinning, stretching, managing the framework that kept life intact. A fire would already be built by dawn, the kindling laid the night before, the coals banked deep in ash to hold their heat until morning. A pot of grain might simmer gently as the house warmed to barley with leeks if they were lucky, or just oats if they weren't. The scent of it, faintly nutty and a little sour, filled the low interior of the home and mingled with the ever-present aroma of smoke and wool. Children were dressed in tunics made by their mothers' hands, sewn with linen or wool, depending on the season. These garments weren't elaborate, but they were tough, made to survive running, climbing, slipping in mud. Clothes were handed down, patched, and let out as needed. Nothing was thrown away unless it couldn't be helped. Spinning was nearly constant. A woman might carry a spindle tucked in the waistband of her apron, and whenever there was a moment waiting for a pot to boil, walking to the well, watching over Chilenchi would spin flax or wool, drawn and twisted with practiced ease, the rhythm so ingrained it hardly required thought. Yarn meant cloth, and cloth meant survival through cold seasons. Those with older daughters would often teach them weaving as early as 7 or 8. The looms were simple. Upright frames leaning against the wall, warped with homespun thread, tensioned with stones or heavy bones. The pattern was slow to emerge, but precise. Line after line, inch after inch, it was slow magic and necessary. Cooking required strategy. Salt was precious and used sparingly. Wild herbs grew near the hedgerows. Marjoram, sorrel, garlic leaves, and were gathered by memory, not map. Women learned to stretch food far. A piece of salted meat reboiled and stewed 3 times. A batch of flatbread from leftover mash, broth thickened with crushed beans or ground acorns. Hunger was not constant, but it was always nearby, a shadow at the edge of the fire. Care extended beyond kin. Women tended to neighbors' children when a mother was in labor, or sick, or grieving. They shared needles and combs, warm water and words. There was no wealth here, not the kind counted in coin, but there was a currency of shared effort, a silent understanding that one family's loss could ripple into everyone's life. There were midwives, not always formally named, but recognized. The woman who had seen the most births, who knew when to heat water, when to press linen to the belly, when to pray louder than usual. Birth was common and dangerous. There were no guarantees. Life began and ended in these rooms, on these floors, under these roofs. And in the early light of this morning, the morning of the raid, some women were already kneading dough, or pouring milk into a churn, or preparing the poultice from dried mint and beeswax. One was humming a song her mother had taught her. Another was brushing ash from the edge of the hearth with a bundle of reeds. Still another was rising slowly, hand on her lower back, the weight of unborn life shifting inside her. None of them knew what was coming, but they had prepared for everything they could. For cold, for hunger, for illness, for birth and death, and the long gray months when the wind never seemed to stop. They had prepared for life. It would not be enough, but for now, before the horn sounds, before the sky fills with smoke, their world was still whole, still wrapped in routine, still warmed by fire and the scent of bread rising. His name might have been Ivor, or Rooney, or something now lost in the folds of time. He was not yet 20, broad-shouldered, but still more boar than man. This was his first raid. He had trained for it, imagined it, prepared in all the ways that his older kin insisted mattered, but nothing prepared him for the silence that came before the noise. The crossing had been long. The sea did not frighten him. It was in his blood, but the waiting did. The cramped spaces between the benches, the ache in his hands from rowing, and the bruises from the butt of a spear that had struck him in practice. The smell of old wool, fish, sweat, the constant noise of creaking wood, the hollow feeling in his stomach that was not quite hunger. There had been excitement when the sails were hoisted and the shore slipped away behind them, but it was not a cheerful excitement. It was quiet, tense. The others had done this before. They told stories, but they were careful not to smile too wide. Those who laughed too much on the way out often failed to return. He had watched the coast appear that morning through the mist green at first, then brown, then solid and looming. The command to row was given. He gripped his oar and pulled, his heartbeat thudding with each stroke. When the keel struck the sand, his breath caught. He did not feel brave. He felt exposed. The others moved quickly. Practiced, he followed, clutching a short axe with both hands, his shield slung too low on his back. His boots hit the wet beach with a slap, and the wind suddenly smelled different, sweeter, like earth and wood smoke. He hadn't expected that. They moved through the outer path, first past brambles and low stone walls, toward the first shapes of human life. He saw a dog bark and flee. A girl stared at him, her mouth open. She didn't move. He didn't know what to do. Then someone shouted behind him, and she was gone. His group spread out. They were not meant to kill unnecessarily. But sometimes it happened. Chaos was its own language, and not everyone understood how to step aside. A man rushed at them with a stick something like a pitchfork. Ivor froze. The man's face twisted into a grimace, and for a second, nothing moved. Then the man fell, struck from the side by another raider. Older, quicker. The noise was dull, but final. Ivor stared at the body for a moment too long. The older man grabbed his arm and hissed something sharp in their own tongue. Move. Keep moving. He kicked open the door of a small. Inside were baskets, hanging herbs, bundles of cloth. No people. He stepped inside briefly, out of breath, and felt how quiet it was. The building seemed to hum with the absence of its owners. A kettle was still warm. He reached out and touched a piece of wool draped over a beam. It was soft. A noise outside drew him back. He left the building and jogged toward the sound. The chapel bell had rung. There was more smoke now. More yelling. A house had collapsed in flame, and the scent hit him hard burnt wood. Straw. Something deeper beneath it. He felt dizzy. Not with fear, exactly, but with the strangeness of it all. He had trained for this. He had listened to the elders speak of glory, of wealth, of proving oneself. But what he felt now was not pride. It was weight. The weight of seeing what it meant to break something. As the sun rose higher, his axe was still clean. He had not struck anyone. He had taken a carved spoon from a windowsill and a length of dyed linen from a storage chest. He tucked them into his belt like prizes, but they felt oddly light. That night, back on the ship, he would lie awake while the older men laughed and drank. He would run his thumb over the edge of the spoon and wonder what kind of hand had carved it. He would not speak. He would not sleep. And when the next raid came, he would move more quickly. Viking raids were not random acts of destruction. They were calculated operations with clear objectives and structured methods and economy built on speed, shock, and strategic withdrawal. Though the chaos appeared total to those under attack, to the raiders, it was often a matter of routine. What they carried away was rarely arbitrary. Silver was the ideal prize coinage, chalices, reliquaries, anything that glittered or could be melted down. But in small villages, silver was scarce, and so the raiders took what they could convert to value in other forms. Livestock was a common target. Cows, sheep, pigs especially. Breeding stock were driven down to the shore, pushed onto boats or slaughtered and preserved on site if transport proved too slow. A well-fed animal was more valuable than a house, and far more portable than a store of grain. Cloth was taken too. Wool was prized, especially if it was dyed or finely spun. Finished tunics, cloaks, and bolts of linen represented hours, sometimes weeks of labor, and could be traded or worn. Raiders knew where to look. The chests beneath sleeping platforms, the stores beside the hearth, the bundles hung near the loom. Tools were not overlooked. Good iron blades, nails, cooking vessels, anything forged or worked with skill. The metal was valuable, but so was the a well-made pot could fetch a handsome trade price far from where it was taken. Sometimes they took people, young men for labor, young women for servitude or sale, children occasionally. Slavery was not uncommon in Norse society, and captives taken during raids became thralls-bound servants, often sold in trading towns as far afield as Dublin or Hidi. It was grim business, but to the raiders, it was business. Nonetheless, oddly enough, money coins was not always the focus. Currency varied wildly in this era, and in many places, it held less meaning than weight or purity. Silver was measured by weight more than face value. A bent coin was still silver. A broken brooch could be melted. A church bell might be smashed into chunks and taken away in sacks. Certain raiders came equipped with balances, small hand scales, and led weights to quickly assess loot on the beach before departing. Efficiency mattered. The longer they lingered, the more likely it was that local forces would organize a There were often time constraints. The tide had to be favorable. The wind had to allow a swift departure. They could not wait for complete plunder. They took what was visible, valuable, or easily carried. Fires were lit not only to destroy, but to distract too, so panic and cover their withdrawal. To the villagers, the loss could feel total. A life reduced to ruins in the space of an hour. But to the raiders, it was a calculated harvest, not of vengeance, nor conquest, of goods, bodies, and wealth in liquid form. We know this from hoards buried caches of wealth, hidden hastily by those who feared raids, or left behind by those who never returned. Some hoards are mixed. Anglo-Saxon coins beside Arabic brooches, hacked silver, chunks of iron. Their diversity tells a story not just of violence, but of networks, of movement, of exchange. In this way, raids were part of a larger system, a dark thread woven through the economy of early medieval Europe. Not isolated events, but part of a pattern. The first hour was the flashpoint, but behind it stood weeks of planning, years of training, and the cold calculations of commerce. Not all communities responded to the threat of Viking raids in the same way. Along the same stretch of coast, two very different worlds could stand each, watching the horizon, each interpreting what it saw through its own lens. On a small headland north of the village stood a not grand, not stone-built or fortified, just a collection of wooden buildings in a clearing beside the sea, where a few dozen monks followed the rule of Saint Benedict. With quiet discipline, they wore rough wool robes. They copied texts by candlelight. They prayed 7 times a day, and they listened to the wind, knowing that it carried more than weather. The monastery had been raided before once, maybe twice, not completely destroyed, but wounded. The bell tower had been toppled in one assault. Its great bronze bell cracked and never replaced. Since then, the monks kept few valuables. The golden chalice had been hidden, its replacement made of wood. Illuminated manuscripts were buried in oilskin beneath the chapel floor, and yet they stayed. For them, the purpose was not security, but obedience. To retreat inland was to abandon their post. The coast was their place of worship. The tide was their clock. Even the fear of death could not outweigh their call to remain rooted in prayer. When raids came, they did not resist. They hid what they could. They prayed. They waited. Some were taken. Some were left. And always, they rebuilt. Contrast this with the meat hall. 2 days' journey inland. Here Athene presided over a larger community and network of farms, outbuildings. The hall was built of oak beams, its walls decorated with iron fittings, antlers, and tapestries, woven with battle scenes. It was a place of power, not peace. The Thane knew of raids. He had fought in one when he was younger, defending a nearby abbey with a half-assembled militia. He had seen what came off those ships. He did not romanticize it. In his hall, defenses were slowly being raised: earthworks, watchposts, signal fires. His reeve had instructed all tenants to gather at the hall during times of danger, bringing livestock and grain. He had sent riders to nearby settlements to coordinate. He was planning a future of defense, and yet he rarely sent aid to smaller villages, not because he lacked concern, but because his responsibility lay elsewhere. With his sworn men, with the land directly under his protection, the web of feudal loyalty had not yet fully formed in these early centuries, and in many places, obligation flowed upward, not outward. From his carved chair, beside the hearth, the Thane would hear reports of burned villages and stolen cattle. He would frown, he would drink, and he would instruct his men to double the night watch. Back on the coast, the monks watched the sea and waited for signs. They saw firelight on the waves before anyone else. They heard the horns before the chapel bells. And sometimes they saw nothing, and only the ghost of sails at the edge of mist, passing silently. 2 worlds, both shaped by the same threat. One endured with patience. One prepared with arms. Neither was ever fully safe. And between them lay the people, the farmers, the fishers, the weavers who had no towers. No gold, no warriors, only homes and hope, and the rhythm of their lives. Before the sails appeared, before smoke twisted into the sky and doors were kicked in and stories were scattered, this was a place of earth. Quiet, damp, difficult earth. And farming was not a profession. It was survival. The soil was poor, laced with salt in some places, stony in others. Plots of land were rarely flat and never wide. Terraces had to be cut into hillsides, roots hacked out, stones pried up by hand. Each patch of ground that could support barley or rye had been earned over years, not seasons. The tools were simple: wooden plows tipped with iron, hoes and spades shaped by hand, sharpened weekly. Oxen were rare and prize-shared between families, or hired for a short time each planting season. When no animals were available, the people pulled the plow themselves, shoulders to the yoke, bodies pressed into the task. Spring was the most hopeful and the most exhausting. Seeds were soaked before planting to speed germination. Weeds were burned back, ash scattered into the soil. Children chased birds away while adults scratched rows into the dirt. Rain was both blessing and threat. Too much, and the fields flooded. Too little, and the crops dried, thin and brittle. Summer was spent in waiting, pulling weeds, turning the soil between the rows, watching the skies. Every wilted leaf was cause for worry, every sprouting stem a small victory. Come autumn, the reaping was done by hand, with short sickles and aching backs. Grain was bundled into sheaves and leaned in circles to dry. Flax was pulled, soaked, pounded, and left to rot just long enough to loosen its fibers. Everything had a rhythm. Each step had a time and place. There was no invention, only inheritance. In winter, the fields rested, but the farmers did not. They repaired fences, fed the animals, sorted seeds, dug ditches to keep water from pooling. The days were short, but the work was steady, and the fires burned. Low fuel had to last. Meat was scarce. Hunting was risky, and often the forests were dark and held more than deer. Most protein came from what could be raised or fished. A smoked eel might be saved for weeks before being eaten. A pig was slaughtered only when necessary, and every part was used: feet, fat, marrow, organs. Waste was not tolerated. Children learned the names of weeds before they learned letters. They could tell edible roots from poisonous ones by age 6. Boys were given small blades and taught how to split kindling and trim bark. Girls learned to gather eggs, twist twine, mend holes. There were no seasons off, no days off, only feast days, and even those required preparation. Bread had to be baked, torches trimmed, garments patched clean. Rest came not as leisure, but as collapse. And yet there was pride in a well-furrowed field, in the green flush of early sprouts, in knowing you could keep your family fed for another year. No one here farmed for wealth. They farmed so their children might live, so they could sleep through the winter without listening for growling bellies. It was not a life that begged for attention. It was not grand or poetic, but it was rooted and real and older than kings. And then, one morning, the field was empty. The rows of barley caught fire. The barn door was ripped from its hinges. The work of years disappeared in minutes. A lifetime of tending burned to ash. But this is not a story of the fire. This is a story of the life that existed before it. The field before the footprint. The hand before the blade. And still, somewhere deep beneath the scorched surface, the roots remained. He wasn't supposed to be in the village that morning. Most days, he stayed out with his sheep then. Pale animals that grazed on the bluff to the east, where the wind carried fewer flies, and the grass clung stubbornly to the rocky slope. He was young, perhaps 13 or 14, and small for his age, often mistaken for a child, though his eyes said otherwise. His name, like so many others, is gone, but his footsteps remain. He had come back early to fetch salt, a small errand, nothing more. The sheep had wandered higher than usual, and he knew he'd have to climb after them that afternoon. Salt would make them easier to manage. He could shake a pouch and lure them back down. So he ran back, barefoot, through the thistles, down the narrow path, worn smooth by centuries of feet. The village was waking. He waved to a woman hanging washed wool over a fence, nodded to an older man sitting by the well. The world felt ordinary, safe. And then the lookout ran through the square, not shouting, not giving orders, just running wide-eyed, pointing behind him. The boy turned. He saw shapes in the mist. Too many, too fast, too silent. The rest happened in fragment shouts, the thud of feet on earth, a door splintering, a goat screaming as it broke from its pen. A man ran past him carrying a child. A woman fell to her knees in the road and screamed a name the boy didn't recognize. He didn't wait. He ran, not toward the sheep, not toward home, but toward the woods. There was a path, there barely a path. Really, just a depression in the earth, winding between brambles and elder trees. He knew it well. He had followed deer trails there, found mushrooms, chased foxes. He ran with everything he had, slipping twice in the mud, scraping his palms. Behind him, the village faded. Not the noise that carried, but the sight of it. The color, the smell. In the woods, everything changed. The air grew damp. The canopy closed overhead. Birdsong returned. Unaware, he slowed, then stopped. His chest heaved. His feet stung. He crouched behind a moss-covered stump and listened, shouting, then less shouting, then only wind. He stayed there for hours. Time moved strangely. He pulled his knees to his chest and counted breaths. A squirrel darted past him. A beetle crawled up his leg and he brushed it away without flinching. He did not cry. Not yet. He waited until dusk, until the sky dimmed, and the birds went quiet again. Then, slowly, he moved. He didn't return to the village, not directly. He circled, watched from the hill. Smoke curled upward in thin, lazy tendrils. The chapel roof was gone. The gate to the livestock pen lay on the ground, swinging in the wind. He descended in the dark, quietly, avoiding every broken twig. There were others, a few. The midwife, one of the smith's sons, a girl who had hidden beneath a pile of straw. They saw each other and said little, just nods, just eyes meeting in the dim firelight. He would not return to the bluff for days. When he did, the sheep were scattered, but alive. He gathered them slowly, calling softly, his voice hoarse from disuse. He carried the salt pouch in his belt. He hadn't dropped it. Years later, when asked how he had survived, he would only say, I was fast. But it wasn't speed alone. It was instinct. It was knowledge of the land. It was the luck of an errand that placed him between chaos and the forest. He didn't save anyone. He didn't fight. But he lived. And that, in this hour, was enough. When the fires die and the people are gone, the land remains, unmoved, unhurried. Centuries later, archaeologists walk these same places, not with weapons or prayer books, but with trowels, soil probes, and survey maps. They do not seek treasure. They seek traces of footprints, ash layers, signs that something disrupted the rhythm of life in an ordinary place. The remains of a raid are rarely theatrical. A scorched beam buried in a trench, a soil stratum blackened by carbonized thatch, a midden once, a trash heap subtly layered with burned grain, crushed pottery, and a copper brooch that someone didn't stop to retrieve. These are not ruins in the cinematic sense. They are subtle palimpsest layers of human action overwritten and obscured by centuries of wind, rain, and moss. The past doesn't shout here. It whispers, and only the patient can hear it. In one site, near Northumbria, radiocarbon dating of a dense ash layer corresponded with a known period of Viking coastal activity. No swords, no bones, just a line of black in the soil, cutting across what had once been a settlement. Burned food stores, a collapsed loom weight, a spindle whorl with a crack down the middle. These findings tell a story in reverse. What was here? Why did it end? Was it sudden? Even pollen can speak. In fields once farmed, sediment samples show a break in sometimes decades when weeds overtook the grain crops. That interruption hints at abandonment, the kind that follows trauma, when the survivors leave, or when no one survives at all. In one case, animal bones were found still in their pens, pigs and goats buried under collapsed fencing, never removed, never consumed. This isn't the sign of famine, it's the sign of flight. There is also what's missing. A village once documented and a regional tithe list paying dues in grain and wool vanishes from records within a single year. Its location, known only from that mention, is believed to correspond with a scatter of charcoal and handmade nails discovered on a lonely patch of moorland. No markers, no cemetery, no second entry, just a single sentence, burned by sea raiders. Nothing remains. In the long stillness that follows, the earth reclaims what it can. Wildflowers grow in the places where floors once were. Roots push through the gaps between timbers. Stone walls sag into the ground. The sounds of violence are replaced by birdsong. But beneath that silence, a different sound persists. It is the memory of interruption, the ghost of a morning when normal life was scattered like ash in the wind. And though the world has moved forward, the land remembers. Even now, if you stand on the coast at dawn, and the mist is low, and the wind soft, it's said you can feel it, the absence, the outline of lives once lived and suddenly lost. Not visible, but present. A quiet, persistent echo. Far from the coast, in stone keeps or timber long halls, men with titles and swords sat beside hearths that never grew cold. They wore wool dyed richer, clasped with brooches carved from jet or silver. They spoke in measured tones, surrounded by scribes, stewards, and armored guards. And yet, they too listened for news from the sea. It did not come by raven. As some tales suggest, it came slowly, carried by monks, merchants, or messengers on foot. A village burned. A church looted. A bell stolen. Survivors, if there were any, might arrive days or weeks later, exhausted and half-starved. Their stories shaped more by trauma than clarity. When a raid occurred on the fringes of a kingdom, the news would filter upward. A Reeves report, a priest's complaint, a traitor speaking of roads blocked by fire and smoke. It was not always believed at first. The distances were great. The realm was large. Many kings ruled only loosely beyond their capital or court. But patterns emerged. A village struck one year, a river town the next, a monastery ransacked, where relics had once drawn pilgrims. The damage wasn't just physical, it was political. Every raid hinted at weakness, at borders uncontrolled, at faith unprotected. Some kings acted day, summoned councils, issued reinforced coastal garrisons if that any others ignored the news, seeing it as a local matter, an inconvenience, a distant storm, and a few responded with spectacle. One such ruler, Othel Wolf of Wessex, ordered processions of prayer after a particularly brutal series of attacks. He sent gifts to Rome, asking for divine protection. Another, Charles the Bald of West Francia, built bridges across the Seine, not for trade, but to block the passage of ships. They were meant as barriers. They often failed. In the wealthiest courts, silver was hoarded, not displayed. Chalices were hidden in vaults. Monastic centers wrote letters begging for armed protection. Some received it. Many did not. Protection required roads, men, time, all of which were limited in the early medieval patchwork of power. For those in royal circles, the raids were a test, not just of defense, but of legitimacy. A king who could not shield his land was a king whose rule was fragile. A lord who failed to defend his tenants might lose their labor and their loyalty. Some hired mercenaries, Saxon swordsmen, Frankish others built alliances, married daughters into families with naval strength. A few sought diplomacy, offering tribute to Viking leaders in hopes of buying peace. These payments, often called danegeld, were controversial, but sometimes effective. For a time, in the quiet chambers of court, far from the smoke and salt, discussions took place over goblets of wine and plates of preserved meats. Maps were unfurled, spoken names of places now gone, names of men who had stood, or fled, or vanished. A report would be recorded. Perhaps a tithe reduced for the survivors, perhaps not. Rarely did kings see what their people sowed: the terror, the ash, the empty homes. They received summaries, distillations, but even at that, remove. Some were haunted. A few rulers left their courts and traveled to the coasts themselves. They spoke to monks. They touched blackened beams. They wept at ruined altars, and then they returned to their halls. The tides kept coming, and so did the ships. She lived near the stream, where the clay was soft and thick beneath the banks. Most mornings, before the village stirred fully, she was already awake, kneeling beside her kiln, checking for cracks in yesterday's firing. Her hands were always stained fingers, pale and dry, nails edged with gray. Pottery was not glamorous work. It was dirty, tedious, and utterly necessary. Every home relied on vessels. For water, for grain, for stew, jugs, bowls, pots, and lids, each shaped by hand, each carrying the mark of its maker. She had learned the skill from her mother, and her mother from hers. No books, no guilds, just long observation and quiet instruction, passed mouth to ear, hand to hand. Her kiln was little more than a pit ringed with stones, roofed with a low clay dome that she repaired often. It smoked on cold days. It sometimes cracked, but it worked. That morning, the morning of the raid, she had a full batch ready to cure. Small cups, 2 wide basins, a bowl with carved edges, etched with a pattern of winding leaves. She was proud of that one. The glaze had taken well, a soft sheen without bubbles. She'd set the fire the night before, feeding it slowly so it would burn low through the night. The coals were still warm when she opened the hatch. The air smelled of char and wet earth. A light mist clung to her shawl as she leaned in to inspect the results. Her house was nearby little more than a single-room lean-to, built from river wood and scraps of wattle. She had no livestock, no children, just tools and clay. Sometimes she traded extra pots for eggs or fish. Most of the time, she simply gave them away. Her work was her offering. As the village began to wake, she moved between kiln and water barrel, carefully cooling the finished pieces, checking for hairline splits. She placed them in a basket lined with dry moss. She intended to carry them to the square later, offer them to the baker in exchange for bread. She didn't hear the lookout. She didn't hear the first shout. She only knew something was wrong when the dog barked. Once loudly, then ran. There was smoke, but not from her kill. A figure darted past her fence barefoot, carrying nothing, eyes wide. She stood still for a heartbeat too long. Then she dropped the basket. The bowl shattered. A clean break. She ran toward the edge of the woods. Her feet splashed through the stream, slipping once, soaking the hem of her skirt. She didn't look back. She knew that hesitation wasted breath. She reached a cluster of birch and threw herself flat against the roots, pressing into the cold, wet ground. Her heart pounded in her ears. She tasted ash and copper on her tongue. From her hiding place, she could see her kill still standing. The fire flickered gently inside. A small curl of smoke drifted upward. One of the raiders passed within 10 feet of it. He didn't stop. He didn't even look. They weren't here for clay. Later, after it was over, after the air had cooled and the shouting stopped, she returned. Her home had been torn open, her tools scattered. The roof partially caved, but the kiln still stood, and inside it, one small cup remained in cracks, untouched, faintly warm. She picked it up with shaking hands. She sat beside the fire and cradled it like something living. Tomorrow, she would begin again. He wasn't a soldier. He had never worn armor, never trained with a sword in formation, but his arms were thick, hardened by years of work at the forge. His back was bent slightly, not from age, but from labor, the kind of strength that doesn't come from battle, but from making the tools others fight with. He was the village smith. Most days, he worked in the open beneath, a wooden lean-to where the bellows hissed, and the coals glowed red from before sunrise too long after dusk. He repaired hinges, sharpened plowshares, shaped iron nails one by one. The hammer was an extension of his body. He rarely spoke while he worked. His rhythm spoke for him. That morning, he had risen early to mend a blade in old seeks, passed down by a neighboring farmer. Its edge nicked and dull. He had heated the forge just enough to shape, not to temper. The anvil was still cool. Then he heard the bell, a single toll, sharp, off rhythm. He turned toward the chapel. Another sound followed, a voice not, a word, but a cry. Then the unmistakable roar of a fire too large, too sudden. He did not run. He picked up his hammer. Not the war kind, the working kind, the one worn smooth at the handle, slightly flattened at one end from decades of striking iron. He tied a leather apron around his waist with steady hands. He walked toward the noise, near the center of the village. Chaos unfurled like cloth in the wind. Smoke, shouts, and figures in motion. He saw a child stumble, get pulled to safety by another. He saw a man fall, fast and limp. He saw one of the raiders dragging a bag of something grain, or cloth, or worse. He gripped the hammer tighter and moved forward. He didn't shout. He didn't charge. He struck. The first blow landed before the raider saw him. The second missed. The third was blocked. He fought not with training, but with precision. Each swing heavy, deliberate, meant to break, not to wound. It couldn't last. There were too many. A shield struck him from the side. He stumbled. Another blow came from behind sharp fast to the leg. He dropped to one knee. The hammer fell. A foot kicked it away. They didn't kill him. He was too valuable alive. Two men bound his arms roughly and dragged him toward the boats. He didn't resist, not anymore. His breath was shallow. Blood leaked into his boot, but his eyes burned. He was thrown to the deck of the nearest ship next to a pile of sacks and barrels. Another captive, a monk, perhaps sat nearby, dazed and bleeding. The smith lay still, head against the boards, listening to the thud of boots, the clatter of stolen goods. His tools were gone. His forge was burning, his village behind him, in pieces. And yet he had struck back, not for glory, not for hope, only for a moment. Only because someone had to. When the ship pushed off, he did not look back. He closed his eyes and listened to the creak of timber, the slap of water against hull, and the rhythmic sweep of oars taking him far from home. The first hour of a raid might burn a village, but the centuries that followed often erased it. For many settlements struck along the coasts, there are no statues, no scrolls, no first-hand accounts, yet a trace remains in the margins of history, in the footnotes of faith, in the quiet ink of distant scribes. Monastic records, particularly in Anglo-Saxon and Irish scriptoria, hold some of the earliest written references to Viking attacks. These entries are rarely detailed. They are brief, formulaic, restrained like the scribes, feared even writing the words too boldly might summon trouble again. A typical entry might read, "In this year, the Northmen came, much suffering. The abbey at Lindisfarne was laid waste. May God avenge the fallen. No names, no weather, no hour, just consequence." Even in the famed Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the accounts grow only slightly longer with time. A sentence or two, a location, a loss, a lament, sometimes a name. If a noble was killed, common villagers were not mentioned. Their stories did not reach the vellum, but in the quiet corners of illuminated manuscripts, we find more subtle records, a marginal note beside a psalm, written in haste. Raiders came yesterday. Brother C is gone. A smear across a prayer, not corrected a drop of ink from a trembling hand, or something darker. Sometimes the art itself changes. In certain gospel books from the 9th century, the serene expressions of saints grow more guarded. The borders once filled with vines and lambs now contain stylized ships, dragons, axes. The fear crept into the margins. These texts were not meant to be journals, but they became them accidentally, through hurried corrections, through strange gaps in couplet passages, through entire books left unfinished in Norse sagas. Centuries later, raids are remembered differently. They're episodes of daring and risk, the sacking of monasteries, the seizing of silver, the testing of a chieftain's will. These stories were told from the other side of the oar, but even they carry shadows, mentions of fierce resistance, of failed attacks, of cursed ground where no ship returned. Gravestones rarely tell us about the raids. Most victims were buried hastily, without carving or ceremony. But in some cemeteries, there are irregular mounds, marked, clustered together, dated by carbon and silence. They are the bones of the uncounted. In a few churches that survived, votive offerings were made after attacks ceased. Crosses hammered from melted jewelry. Bells cast from broken tools. These were offerings of survival, not triumph. They were left not in joy, but in awe of having endured. And then there are the songs, lullabies with verses that don't quite rhyme, folk tales about ships that come from fog and vanish before dawn, proverbs that warn against the sea. When the wind turns from the north, no one remembers where they started, but they all begin the same way. Something is quiet, and then it's not. Elsewhere, inland, past the forests, and the rivers, and the reaches of wind that carried the scent of salt and smoke, a merchant dined with his guests beneath carved beams and linen-covered tables. The food was warm, the wine was spiced, and the concerns of coastal farmers felt very far away. His hall was modest by noble standards, but rich compared to the homes of common folk. Imported cloth draped the benches, and the floor was covered in woven mats, dyed with crushed berries and bark. A fire burned in a central hearth, and above it a copper cauldron simmered with a stew of lentils, dried fruit, and bits of seasoned meat mutton, likely, though he would call it lamb. This merchant did not inherit land. He purchased it. Slowly, strategically. First, a few acres near a ford, then access rights to a portion of the river. Eventually, a grain mill. Now, he sold not only goods, but the use of his road, his wagons, his name. His wealth came in streams. Salt, iron tools, fine combs from abroad, and sometimes slaves. He did not raid, but he bought from those who did, not directly. Never so crude. He had contact traders from the north, speaking clipped dialects and carrying goods of strange shape and smell. Silver hacked into chunks, rough-cut gems, furs to course for local fashion, and sometimes captives. They arrived tired, silent, their wrists scarred, their clothes torn. He paid fairly. He did not ask questions. They became servants in his household, or commodities, to be moved along routes that others pretended not to see. At this particular dinner, one of his guests mentioned a report from the coastal village burned, a storehouse lost. The merchant raised an eyebrow, sipped from a cup, and murmured a half-hearted prayer. Terrible, he said. May God shelter the survivors. But the topic changed quickly. A new tax being proposed, a trade embargo rumored in the east, a rival's misstep at market. The coastal fires faded like dream smoke on cold stone. For men like this merchant, the raids were abstract news, to be processed, assessed, and filed away. The world, for them, was not defined by the smoke on the horizon, but by margins and alliances, risk and return. The merchant's house had no weapons, no walls, but it was far enough inland to feel secure. And if not secure, at least he kept a chest of silver hidden in the floor, not from raiders, but from the taxman. He feared audit more than axe. His wife poured wine. His children played in a corner. The candles burned evenly, without draft, and on the table sat a comb carved from whalebone, to find for local make, purchased weeks ago from a man who spoke little and watched everything. It had been taken from a monastery likely, or from someone who once used it every morning, beside a fire on the coast, never thinking it would one day rest. Beside meat and wine in a warm house far away, the merchant admired its craftsmanship, but not its journey. That story, like many others, was never asked. It didn't need to be. In the rhythm of village life, the elderly often moved in the background, not idle, not helpless, but slower. Their wisdom was not ceremonial. It was practical. They knew which plants soothed the stomach, which clouds brought frost, which child lied the least when caught near the honey stores. They worked, but differently, thoughtfully. That morning, one old man was splitting firewood. He wore a wool tunic that had faded from color to threadbare gray. His hands were thick with callus, the joints stiff with time. He moved without haste, lifting a small axe, striking short logs with soft, rhythmic effort. The pile beside him was modest, enough for 2 or 3 days. His house sat near the edge of the village by the barley plots. It was quiet there, even when the rest of the town stirred. He liked it that way. From his bench, he could hear the birds wake. He could watch the morning mist drift down from the hill and dissolve slowly into light. Inside, his wife tended to the stores. She had a way of organizing shelves that hadn't changed in 50 years. Herbs hung from rafters. Seeds were bundled in waxed cloth. A wheel of cheese, pressed weeks earlier, was gently turned to prevent. Their grandchildren lived 2 houses away. Sometimes they came to visit, bringing bundles of rushes, or pebbles, or excuses. They didn't come this morning. They were off gathering eggs. The old man paused in his work to stretch. His breath was slow, steady. His back ached in the familiar way. He squinted toward the horizon. There was something strange in the light. Not the sun, a flicker, a thickness to the air. He listened not to birdsong, not to the wind, to something else, a horn, distant, mournful. Then shouting, he didn't run. He set down the axe and moved inside. He told his wife to take the cellar ladder, the one half hidden behind the woven mats. She looked at him, saw the line of his mouth, and did not argue. She descended slowly, stiff-kneed but firm. He followed, closing the hatch behind them. The cellar was low and cool. It smelled of apples and dried sage. He had once dug it out himself, in the days when he was strong enough to shift earth alone. Back then, he hadn't known what he was building it for. Now, he did. They sat together in the dark. Above, the noise grew. The man placed a hand on his wife's arm. They said nothing. They had lived through storms, through sickness, through years. When the crop failed and the river iced over early, they had lost children. They had buried friends. They would wait, not in fear, but in the deep stillness of people who had lived long enough to know that the world does not always ask for permission before it changes. Later, if they were spared, they would climb the ladder again. And if not, then at least they had met the hour as they had lived. Together, in quiet and the chapel sat on the rise, barely higher than the rest of the village. It was not grand. Its roof sagged, where the beams met. The door leaned slightly from years of use and repair. But it was sacred, and it was known, and it held something no other structure did. The bell hung from a thick timber beam just beneath the eaves. The bell was cast of simple bronze. It had no inscription, no adornment. Its note was plain, slightly wavering, but unmistakable. It called people to prayer. It marked deaths. It sounded for weddings and warnings alike. The bell ringer was an old woman named Oswald. She was not clergy, not officially, but she had served the chapel since she was a girl. She swept the floor, trimmed the tallow lamps, stacked the rushes, and kept the bell's clapper clean of dust and bird droppings. No one else in the village had ever rung it. That morning, she had been laying new rushes along the chapel's central aisle, kneeling slowly and carefully to press them flat. The space smelled of old wax and damp stone. Light slanted in through a single high window. Her hands were bent from years of work, but they were steady. She heard the horn first, then a scream. She stood slowly, stiff-legged, and walked to the chapel door. It opened with a soft creak. Outside, she saw blurred people running, fire catching thatch, the shape of a ship's prow beyond the hedgerow. She did not panic. She turned and walked to the rope. Her hands wrapped around it. The hemp was worn smooth, where it passed through the beam. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she pulled. The bell rang. Once. A clear, low tone that rolled down the hill and across the rooftops. It cut through the chaos. People turned their heads. Some paused. Others ran faster. She rang it again. And again. With each pull, her arms shook more. The weight was familiar, but her strength had waned. Still, she pulled again and again. Down in the village, a mother who had frozen in fear turned toward the sound and moved. A group of children hiding behind a stack of firewood sprinted toward the woods. A man bleeding from a cut to his scalp lifted himself and followed the sound. The raiders heard it too. They knew what it meant. They moved toward the sound. Oswith kept ringing. One entered the chapel quietly. A man with pale hair and a short axe. He looked at her, then at the bell. He did not shout. He stepped forward. She did not flinch. She pulled the rope one more time. The bell rang out, one final, hollow note. Then it fell silent. Later, long after the raiders had gone, the chapel stood scorched, but the bell still hung, slightly askew, the rope frayed at the base. No one rang it again, but those who had heard it that morning never forgot. It was not a call to arms. It was not a hymn. It was the sound of someone standing alone against the tide. And for a moment, that sound was louder than fear. In the wake of a raid, the silence is heavy. No horns, no footsteps, just wind through broken doorways, embers collapsing into themselves, and the sound of flies already beginning their work. Those who return, if they return at all, are left with decisions few are prepared to make. The dead are everywhere, some known, some barely recognizable, some never found. And yet, even amidst destruction, people bury their own, often hate, always reverently. But archaeologists today don't always find those burials. In many early medieval dig sites along the coasts of England, Ireland, and Francia, something peculiar appears again and again. Evidence of destruction: burned homes, broken tools, plundered storehouses, but little to no evidence of organized burial activity. No marked cemeteries, no proper grave goods, no aligned bodies, just gaps. In some cases, this means bodies were taken burned with the houses, lost in the flight, buried in secret places, not meant to be remembered. In others, they may have been left where they fell, only later to become untraceable in the archaeological record. What remains instead are impressions, soil disturbances with no bones, shallow pits dug in haste, charcoal-rich layers where wood and flesh may have burned together, burned offerings interspersed with damaged religious items. One particularly telling find emerged from a site near in eastern Ireland. Beneath the collapsed timbers of a chapel, an odd collection of items was discovered: 3 iron nails, a loop of wool string, a small ivory cross, and an infant's feeding vessel made from horn. No bodies. But nearby, the ground was discolored, in a shape roughly human. No record. Only the suggestion that someone was laid to rest, hurriedly, when the flames cooled. In another village, post holes from a former hall had been reused to hold grave markers, makeshift ones, carved with simple crosses. They weren't placed in rows. They didn't form a cemetery. They were scattered like apologies. It's possible, too, that the survivors themselves could not stay. The act of burial may have been incomplete, because those who might have mourned were forced to flee. A raided village, even if left half standing, might never truly be, and so we are left with a different kind of evidence. Not stone crypts or ossuaries, but spaces where people should be, structures intact, but no population. A loom left mid-thread, a cooking pot still on the hearth, long cold. Archaeologists call these abandonment indicators, signs that life was interrupted, not gradually, but with force. There is no poetry in these absences, only unanswered questions. Who buried the child behind the chapel? Who placed the comb beside the hearth before running? Who marked the place where the reed fell, if anyone did at all? The dead are not lost in history. They're misplaced, covered not by time, but by silence. Within the stone cloisters of a small episcopal seat, likely in a town untouched by raids, but not untouched by Fira, Bishop dipped his quill into ink and began to write. His script was steady, practiced, Latin mostly, though laced with local idioms. When speaking of the common folk, his letter was intended for another cleric, or perhaps a noble patron, a report, a reflection, a warning. He wrote of fire on the coast, of villagers stripped, of relics stolen, of the loss of one particular chapel, the one near the river mouth, where the bell had long rung over the barley fields. He did not name the villagers. He did not know them, but he grieved their loss. In terms of sacredness, of altar desecrated, of faith interrupted. He mentioned the survivors to fewer than expected, weary, traumatized. Some had arrived at his city walls with smoke still in their hair, ash still pressed into the folds of their sleeves. He ordered that they be given bread, water, clean cloth, but he could not house them all. There was no space, and in truth, not much will. The bishop's world was administrative. He was not cold, but he was constrained. He had accounts to balance, donations to secure, church repairs to schedule. He was part shepherd, part steward. The language of trauma filtered through his office slowly, dulled by repetition and distance. In his letter, he described the raiders not as men, but as instruments of divine punishment, a phrase borrowed from a psalm. He believed, or at least preached, that the raids came because faith had weakened, that sin had crept into quiet corners of the countryside: pride, sloth, disrespect for God's order. The solution, he wrote, was piety, order, public penance. He proposed fasting. He proposed processions. He proposed the collection of relics from further inland, safer places, so they might be venerated without fear. There was no mention of defense, No call for arms. That was the work of kings and earls. The church, in his mind, must resist through purity, through discipline, through prayer. He closed his letter with a blessing and a request for funds. Always funds. A new bell was needed for the chapel that had fallen. The old one, he believed, had been taken and melted down, or worse, used in heathen rites. As he sealed the letter with wax, he paused. He looked out through the narrow arched window of his stone chamber. Far below, in the shadow of the cathedral, families huddled in the square, survivors in borrowed cloaks, heads bowed, children with chapped lips, mothers with empty hands. They made no demands. They simply waited. The bishop turned from the window. He handed the letter to a courier and returned to his desk, where another parchment awaited. More news from the north, more reports of ships, more loss. He sharpened his quill and began again. Before the horns, before the shouting and the smoke, there was another sound. A giggle, half muffled, near the chicken coop. A boy and a girl, not yet 10 winters old, crouched low in the dewy grass, trying to coax a hen into a basket without startling it. Their breath came in clouds, and their hands were cold, but their eyes shone. Children woke early in the village, not from obligation, but because the day began with motion, and they liked to be a part of it. Their tasks were light but constant: feeding animals, gathering kindling, drawing water, shooing birds from grain. There were no toys, as we think of them. Play was tucked between errands, stitched into chores. A stick became a spear. A stone became a fort. Straw was braided into whips, tossed back and forth in pretend contests. The smallest ones liked to follow the older children, watching their movements, copying the way they tossed rope or balanced baskets on their hips. Breakfast was simple: a crust of bread dipped in broth, a bite of cheese, if it hadn't gone too soft. Sometimes, milk still warm from the cow. The children sat cross-legged near the fire, listening as adults murmured about weather, fences, or the strange ache in someone's shoulder. The talk was slow, unhurried. These were not days to be rushed. Some children learned letters, if a priest or a monastic visitor had time to teach. Others learned numbers, by counting eggs or weighing barley. But most learning was unspoken: how to mend a rip without wasting thread, how to dry mushrooms in a warming pan, how to know the difference between the bark of a fox and the bark of a dog. They learned stories, too, not from books, but from voices, tales of giants and spirits, of old gods and patient saints. Some tales were warnings, others were comfort. All of them were remembered in small pieces, passed along with rhythms more than words. That morning, a few children had been sent to gather reeds from the riverbank. They skipped flat stones across the water. One girl sang to herself. Another climbed a tree and claimed she could see to the edge of the world. The others laughed. No one disagreed. Why would they? When the lookout ran, some children didn't understand. They thought it was a game. When the first scream echoed from the chapel hill, they froze not from comprehension, but from instinct. Something ancient stirring behind the ribs, something older than words. A boy grabbed his sister's hand and ran. Another child dove into a pile of straw. One stood perfectly still, eyes wide, watching the sails come closer through the mist. They scattered. Some would hide, some would be found. Some would not be seen again. But before the wave crashed over them, they had laughter. They had stories. They had soft moss and the warmth of the sun on bare arms. And in this silence, after those who remembered would speak softly of that morning, the last time things were as they had always been. The last time the village echoed with the laughter of children. Her name was Berla, or something close to it. The records don't preserve her, but the stories passed down mention an old woman with a limp, a bundle of herbs, and a voice that never rose above a whisper. She had delivered most of the children in the village and helped bury more than a few. She was the one you sent for in the quiet emergencies of life, birth, illness, fever, death. That morning, Bella had been tending to a young woman in labor. The pains had started in the night, mild at first, then growing stronger with each hour. The husband had run for Bela before dawn, barefoot, panicked. She had arrived before the sun was high, her kit tucked beneath her cloak, her hands clean and steady. The woman was young, her first child. Her fear was the kind that took the voice out of her, leaving only clenched teeth and sweat-drenched sheets. Bela knelt beside her. She spoke softly. She lit a small lamp and crushed dried chamomile between her fingers. She massaged the girl's spine with oil. She hummed a tune so old it had no name. Outside, the village stirred with its usual noises. Inside, time narrowed to the space of a room, the rhythm of breath, the tension of each contraction. Then came the horn. Bela froze for only a moment. She had heard that sound once before. Many years ago, she told the husband to bolt the door. She told the mother to breathe. She closed the shutters, covered the hearth, dimmed the room. The labor continued. Outside, chaos bloomed. She heard shouting, a scream, a crash. The husband stood by the door, pale as ash, holding a fire poker with shaking hands. Bela didn't look up. She stayed beside the mother, pressing her hand against the girl's belly, murmuring steady instructions. The child was close, and still, the world collapsed around them. Smoke crept beneath the doorframe. The sound of boots, so many boots passed. By outside, a baby cried nearby. Not theirs. Another child, fleeing. The husband flinched. Bela kept working. She tied the cord with twine. She wiped the newborn clean with a rag soaked in warm water. She did it all by candlelight, her own breath ragged now. She didn't speak until the crying started thin, alive, urgent. The mother sobbed in relief. Bela wrapped the baby in wool, handed it to the girl, and turned to the door. She told the husband where to hide them. The cellar beneath the floor, covered by rush mats and firewood. She told them to stay quiet, no matter what. And then she opened the door. She stepped outside. The village was smoke and motion. She walked with purpose toward the chapel, away from the house. Her limp was more pronounced now, but she didn't stop. Some saw her, a few raiders, a few villagers. No one followed. Later, long after the raid, when the survivors gathered to rebuild, they spoke of she had walked out to draw attention away from the child, to keep the birth from being discovered, to place herself between flame and cradle. No one found her body, but in the ashes of the path, near the chapel, someone found a scorched bundle of crushed herbs, still bound with red thread. It's easy to think of history as built from stone of castles, temples, towers left behind. But most of early medieval Europe wasn't carved in granite. It was woven from timber, thatch, mud, and time. When fire came, those structures didn't become ruin. They became air. And yet, archaeologists can still find them not in what's there, but in what's missing. A burned house leaves a ghost in the ground. Post holes arranged in neat ovals or rectangles. Packed soil where the hearth once lay. Charcoal traces where the beams fell inward. If a home collapsed under flame, the weight crushes what it can't burn. Clay pots break inward. Loom weights drop straight down. Grain turns black and glassy from heat. These shapes are red like shadows. In a dig near the banks of the Seine, a village layout was reconstructed from these ghosts. 35 structures, all timber. Nearly half of them showed clear signs of fire damage falling on stones. Ash layers beneath floors, scorched earth beneath where door frames once stood. But there were no signs of rebuilding, no reoccupation layers. The site was abandoned. Why? Not because they couldn't rebuild, but because they wouldn't. In cultures built on oral memory, places of great trauma were sometimes left behind, not for practical reasons, but spiritual ones. Once blood was spilled, once fire had risen, and the bell fell silent. The land itself might be seen as marked and fit, unsafe, unclean. Even later generations, returning to the same region, would build elsewhere. Up the road, beyond the hill, close but not too close. Some archaeological sites show this clearly. A burned village, silent. A generation later, a new settlement identical in layout. And yet, the earth does not forget the first place. There's a term used in archaeology, negative space. It means more than emptiness. It means absence that defines presence, a missing beam that shows where the roof once rested, a patch of disturbed soil in a line of undisturbed field-proof of a wall, a trench, a hurried grave. Negative space is everywhere in the record of raids. A ring of stones with nothing inside, a broken spindle lying too far from any structure, a cache of valuables buried just inches too deep to be casual, never retrieved. Sometimes the clearest sign of a raid isn't a sword or a burn pattern. It's a place where life stopped, suddenly. No gradual disuse, no erosion, just interruption. The villagers did not leave markers. They had no time for epic, but their silence remains, and the soil beneath their homes speaks for them. Not in volume, but in precision. It tells us, here was a door. Here was a child's bed. Here was a fire that did not burn out tit, was extinguished. Here, something ended. She was not poor. Her home had 2 stories and a tiled hearth. Her shoes were leather, not straw, and she had seen the sea only once on a spring journey with her husband, years before the raids began. They had stayed inland after that. They had built wealth, bought land, sold grain, cloth, iron, employed laborers, hosted visitors, and now, in her later years, she lived in a walled house behind an iron-banded gate. No one entered without her notice, not even the housemaids. She was careful. She hadn't always been this way. Long ago, before the fine linens, before the tiled hearth, she had lived in a village by the sea, not unlike the one we've visited so many times now in these hours, and she remembered it clearly. The slope of the fields, the color of the morning sky, the shape of the smoke curling from chimneys, and the one scream that broke her world open. She had been a girl then, perhaps 11. She'd been feeding chickens. Her mother had been kneading dough. Her father was at the well. The raiders had come suddenly, and by nightfall, the village was gone. She had survived by hiding in a ditch, beneath rotting rushes, her arms scratched, her feet bare. She remembered the insects more than the screams, the tickle of legs crawling up her skin as she kept still, trying not to breathe too loudly. She never saw her mother again. Her father was found the next day. The only thing left of him was his belt, still fastened, stained, lying near the chapel gate. She had been taken in by distant cousins, then apprenticed to a cloth merchant, then married. She never told her husband the full story. He didn't ask, but every time a cart rumbled too close at night, she awoke. Every time the wind howled at the eaves, she got up to check the door latch. Every time someone mentioned the coast, her hands tightened around whatever she was holding. Now, in her fine house, with the velvet curtains and the polished brass basin, she still moved like a child in hiding. Quiet, alert, watchful. When her husband hired a steward to manage their new estate near the river, she made only one request. Not too close, she said. Not where the sea can find us. He chuckled. Agreed. Thought it was a matter of taste. But it wasn't. It was memory. A memory that wore fine clothes now, that served wine to guests, and lit candles, and polished sconces, but never forgot the smell of thatch burning, or the sound of boots in the dirt, or the weight of mud in her mouth as she stayed absolutely still. She would never return to the coast. She didn't need to. It followed her. Every quiet evening, every creak of timber, every moment when the world felt just a little too still. The raid had ended. The longships were gone. The sea was quiet again, but the village was not. What was left stood in silent, smoldering rooftops, walls leaning like drunks after a storm. The blackened skeleton of the chapel still sending up the occasional ribbon of smoke. Not all buildings had burned. Not all people had fled. But the rhythm of life had stopped, and now it had to be rebuilt from a different place. Rebuilding did not begin with tools. It began with breath, with survivors stepping carefully over collapsed beams, searching for something they could still use: a cooking pot, not cracked, a roof beam still strong, a cloak that hadn't been scorched. Rebuilding began with gathering. The village moved slowly. The living counted the dead, not aloud, but with their eyes watching for the faces that didn't reappear, for the voices that no longer asked to borrow a hook or offer a loaf. Grief was silent. Loud grief was a luxury. The children were the first to shift back into motion. They scavenged what they could: pebbles, bits of cloth, twisted nails, and brought them to the adults like gifts. One girl found a wooden bowl and hugged it like a doll. The men took stock. What could be repaired? What had to be torn down? Whose animals had survived? How many fields would still yield? Each question felt heavy, like lifting a wet blanket from a fire. The women cleaned what they could, scrubbed soot from skin, washed wounds, rewrapped cloth around feet gone blistered from fleeing barefoot. They mended silence with routine. Some of the old returned first, those who had hidden longest, deeper in the woods, buried beneath earth or thatch or memory. They emerged, blinking, slower, but they came back with knowledge: how to build when nails were gone, how to shape walls from turf and stone, how to boil herbs to treat burns. There was no ceremony, no speeches, just labor. A small shed was cleared and turned into a place for the wounded. A few burned beams were lashed together to form a new lean-to. The chapel bell, cracked but still intact, was dragged upright and propped on a makeshift frame. It wouldn't ring again, but it was there, and that mattered. The survivors did not talk much about what they'd seen. They didn't need to. Everyone had seen something. Everyone had lost something. They lived in a space where words would only reopen the hole they were trying to fill. Instead, they watched the sky. They watched for clouds, for birds, for sails, and each time they heard the wind shift, a few flinched. Still they remained. They sowed what grain was left. They patched fences with twine and bone. They sang again, quietly, as they stirred pots and carded wool. Not the songs of joy. Not yet, but the kind of songs that remembered what came before. And in time, the village grew quieter, then steadier, like a heartbeat restarting after too long, a pause. Because survival was not just escaping the raid. It was deciding to stay after. Years later, perhaps a generation, perhaps too, the raid had become a story, not one sung in halls or carved in stone, but told quietly, at night, beside her. As the embers faded and the winds pressed gently against the shuttered windows, it was passed from voice to voice, changing slightly each time, not in substance, but in shape, more memory than record, more shadow than map. Children would ask about it, and the old would hesitate. Then, softly, the story would come. They would say that once, when the mist was thick and the sky low, the ships came. They would say they rose from the sea like creatures, silent at first, then sudden. That fire danced along rooftops, that brave men fell quickly, that a bell rang out even as the chapel cracked open, that the sea took things away and left others behind. The story did not name heroes. It named survivors. A boy who ran barefoot into the woods, a woman who clutched her newborn beneath the floorboards, a smith who struck one blow before falling, a midwife who walked into smoke to save silence. Their names were not written, but their choices remained. Not every child believed the stories were real. They seemed too sharp, too narrow, too close. But in winter, when the cold wrapped the house and the wind carried strange rhythms across the thatch, even the doubters listened closely, just in case. Sometimes, someone would speak the name of the village quietly, reverently, and someone else would shake their head. We don't say it aloud anymore. That was long ago. Let it rest. But memory doesn't rest. It lives in habits passed down, in food salted carefully, in tools stored in a second place, in the way doors are bolted at dusk and the fire's always banked just right, so it never dies completely during the night. In the hush that falls, when distant horns are heard they wind, or thunder, or something less explainable. The raid did not just happen. It stayed, not as trauma alone, but as structure, as story, as a caution passed on not to frighten, but to prepare. The children who heard it grew up. Some left. Some stayed. Some built new houses with stone instead of wood. Some turned to other gods, other languages, other maps. But all of them remembered that once there was a village near the sea, and that for 1 hour everything changed. Now the fires have long burned out. The bell has fallen silent. The sails have vanished beyond the horizon, and we return slowly, gently to the present. The hour of the raid is over. Its first heartbeat has passed. The smoke has lifted, and in its place, only memory remains. Memory, in the soft hush of a world that survived in pieces. You've walked now through that hour not with sword in hand, but with eyes wide open. You've stood beside the hearths, the fields, the looms. You've crouched in the cellars and heard the distant horns. You've watched as ordinary lives bent under the weight of something sudden, and then endured. And perhaps now, in the stillness around you, you understand a little more about what it meant to survive. Not in defiance, not in strength, but in quiet, careful persistence. The raid was 1 hour, but life was every hour after. And so the stories carried forward not as warnings alone, but as that even under ash, roots remain. That even in the cold, something remembers the shape of warmth. That those who lived through the worst of it did not become louder. They became steady. Tonight, as you rest, the past no longer presses. The sails are distant. The village sleeps once more. The sea is calm again, and the wind carries only the scent of damp earth and old wood. Let it carry you, too. Let your breath settle like the tide returning to shore. Let your thoughts quiet like the bell that rang once and was never needed again. You are far from the fire now. You are safe, and sleep is near.